Perfect.
Sorry about that.
Right. Oh, all good.
It's good to see you all.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, just to clarify the purpose of this, it's to get feedback on work in progress. So in our product development flow, we have the design phase where we diverge and converge on solution ideas, and a big part of that process is getting input from the whole team, engineers, PMs, maybe even other teams that our designs might impact. And also get ready for, in the design phase, we prepare for solution validation. So internally, we converge on something that we believe is MVC, and then we move on to get validation from end users, and then it goes into planning breakdown. So that this meeting is really important for the flow of our work and getting input from engineers.
Yeah, exactly. Because before we were just having designers pass back and forth ideas, and then we're like, we should get our engineers in here. That would be more valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, if we start asking, is this feasible? That's probably.
Yeah.
And honestly, like the whole team too has enough creativity and experience of the product to come up with like whole new ideas that we can pursue too. So it isn't just about trying to find the feasibility. It's about uncovering a lot of different ways we can solve problems. Anyway,
yeah, totally.
That's my PSA for the purpose of this meeting. So everybody knows.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I think it's helpful to reinforce the purpose of our meetings, especially when they're refreshing with new faces. So with that, I'll jump right back into the agenda so we can give Daniel the latter half of the meeting. We're currently on the compliance side, moving through an iteration idea to improve like the call to action for expired personal access tokens. But during this idea, I was asking Matt, like, we're basically telling the user they need to renew their token, meaning like you need to delete it and recreate one, which is kind of annoying. Like if I were to do that myself, I basically would try and like copy the same name, copy the same permissions, and then delete it. So then I was thinking, well, why don't we just give them an ability to renew? And I didn't like my idea right off the bat for a couple of reasons, but I'll show you what that looks like. And I want to get some feedback on it. So, I mean, the simplest idea I had was just like throwing a renew button in there, which would handle all the logic behind it. But one, I hate how it looks. So that's the first thing. I think it's just too much going on. And the second thing is, I don't even know if it's necessarily possible to renew a token. My thinking is what we could do is extend the expiration date by whatever the initial difference was from its creation to expiration. So if I wanted to say something was going to expire in 60 days, I hit renew, it gives me another 60 days on the token. But I don't know if that's necessarily plausible from a backend perspective. And then I also hate the design. So I wanted to show it and see what others thought.
Is there a reason for the empty space on the left, or is that an odd display problem?
Yes, there is, and it's just because of the layout of the page itself.
You can change that. Or you're seeing, you mean you're scrolling down, that's why it's the settings page.
It's the settings page. I can show how it actually shows up. You see how it's got this text up here? I mean, yeah, the whole page could be reformatted, but it was kind of outside of the scope of this particular thing. But yeah, that's why you end up seeing this weird blank space is when you scroll down, there's a big blank space.
So just looking at this quickly, technically it's definitely, I think, possible from the backend, but don't quote me on that, to actually renew a token. One way of doing it, like I said, would be to take the default date and then renew it by the difference. So if it was a month ago, or the original creation date and the expiration date, and take that difference. The other would be to take the enforced expiration date from an admin setting, but I am wondering about the language in this case, and I'm not super familiar with it. I have worked with this a bit. The thing that I'm wondering about is whether or not the language renew fits tokens, because we would essentially need to create a new token. Or I'm wondering if the best practice wouldn't be to create a new token rather than extending a token over and over, and whether or not that is allowed, considering that we're applying some settings to actually clamp down on personal explorations, on personal access tokens, and trying to make them, for compliance purposes, trying to make them expire. So if a user can just renew it over and over, is that something that we want to allow?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I understand it is it's optional to require the enforcement of expiration. So like if the admin at maybe it's the instance level turns it on, then tokens don't actually get revoked when they expire. They just kind of remain active. And so what I would want to be combating against is like those tokens just remaining expired and users not wanting to go through the hassle of scrolling up on the page, putting in the information again, and revoking the current token to create a new one, because they aren't actually enforced if that is the settings set up for that. But I think you bring up a good point. Like, are we just allowing bad behavior to persist further? Possibly. That's a good question to ask.
Yeah, I think this is something we can get Matt to maybe weigh in terms of from a compliance and customer perspective, whether or not that this is something that our customers would want, and whether or not it's something that should, if we were to implement it, should we make it optional?
From like a UI perspective, because this table is so tight, does anybody have ideas on how to be able to show multiple actions without like making one more discoverable than the other? Like I guess it could be like a split button drop down, or it could be like an ellipses button, but then you're masking something.
Could we just use two square icon buttons?
Yeah, that was about to be my suggestion also. Just use adjacent icons.
Yeah.
And just make them blatantly, obviously, green and red with like a stop and a check.
Yeah, I guess the thing is like just using icons alone generally is bringing up the problem where you're assuming what those icons mean. I suppose we could use a
tooltip hover. Yeah.
Okay, I'll think on it. All right, Daniel, take it away.
So super early still. I'm waiting for two other folks to show up.
Oh, really quick. Sorry, Austin. I don't know if this is relevant, but we do have a button type that looks more like a link. So it wouldn't be like this huge button with all this boundary around it. It would just be like a piece of text that you can click, right? But it's still a button.
Yeah.
But it has like a transparent boundary.
Are you thinking of the blue hyperlink button or like the tertiary button?
I don't know what tertiary looks like, but it'd be like the blue hyperlink button.
Okay.
With the and I think that would kind of solve your problem where you don't want to just use an icon because that could mean different things. But anyway, just want to throw it out there that there's that option too. There's components we have that are a little more efficient in terms of maybe there's
this one, and then there's another one that's like the same thing but the text is blue, basically.
You could also potentially do like I don't know if this would be like a good use case for this, but the settings icon, and then you click it and it has two options, renew or revoke. So it's just like really small, and people, or I assume people know that the little like cog is settings, because that's usually what it is.
Yeah.
So that could potentially be an option, I guess.
Yeah,
That's a
good
good
point.
suggestion.
There's also the kebab, the vertical kebab.
Yeah.
I think it's called the more menu.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
And
something like
I
that.
see that used. I see that used in some other places. I think I've seen
it
that
in a
on
couple other places.
labels. The only option in the drop down I think is delete, but I think it's there.
Yeah, you could put a whole menu under that.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of reversing things, right? Putting the menu in the kebab instead of the kebab in the menu. But anyway, I'll stop trying to make jokes. Anyway, sorry, Daniel. I had a
no. I loved it. It was worth it for the upside down kebab. I love that because I could actually kill for a vertical kebab right now.
I know, so could I. Kebab in the morning, best thing.
The half-eaten kebab from the 2 a.m. booze cruise is always nice. So yeah, I don't have the rest of the folks I had invited yet, but I can kind of explain the issue right now while we wait. So we're doing the category maturity scorecard on subgroups. And part of that is a requirement to schedule some testing participants. And in discussing this with Mike, he brought up the case of how should I or investigate the solutions I would need to come up with to create a testing environment for people to be able to interact or follow through a sequence of tests around subgroups. And so I was speaking with Kat, and I was thinking, well, how could we do this? Because if I created a dummy group on the website, then the environment will inherently be not a pristine environment. They'll already have the environment established. And the second part of that is that because of that, it's not a pristine environment. They have to then, if we're going to try and create a pristine environment, have to set up a process through a new account setup, which then ties back to the object of a group. So if I want to then evaluate how does the user understand a group and then the subgroup aspect, do I need to then expand the research proposal to include groups? Kat brought up a good point about that, is because we don't have any sort of research or investigation around the category maturity for groups in itself. And breaking groups up from subgroups didn't necessarily make sense to Kat. And so expanding on the testing scenario, would it make more sense to use a setup where they would go through a totally blank process with no predefined setup, because then they would get the total clean experience, versus me going in there and setting up, here's the group, and now I want you to set up subgroups, because you've disconnected that entry point to the subgroup process. So you've lost that ability for testing. How does a user create the initial subgroup from zero?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
What's your we need to back up a little bit so that people can track what's going on. So the category maturity scorecard is Peter and I forgot how to pronounce your name. Is it Jan or Gian?
Yeah.
The last one?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Peter and Gian, you may not have a lot of an insight into what category maturity scorecards are. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm hearing a head shake no. So we currently have a category maturity page, and what we've been doing in the past is like, we'll say, we believe kind of subjectively that subgroups is complete versus viable. So it kind of goes like minimal, viable, complete, lovable, I believe. And so lovable would actually imply like it's working well, people love it. And then minimal is like, we've just started like maybe like 1 or 2 iterations on this capability, right? Like design management is still in minimal, I believe, because we need internal adoption to bring it to viable. So with subgroups, it was a sort of subjective grade of, I believe it's complete right now. And we want to validate
great.
that with end users. Where in the past we haven't validated that with end users. So what Daniel's doing is putting together a study where we identify a job to be done, and then we write scenarios where someone could actually exercise or use the current subgroups featured in GitLab and to accomplish those scenarios to achieve that job to be done. Like the thing they hired GitLab for, they can do. And so when we watch people go through these scenarios, and we're going to record them, in video, we actually have like a grading system that will help us have an objective measure of how complete it really is. And if that grade comes in and it's actually like viable, then we'll reduce the maturity level down to viable instead of complete. Or maybe it turns out it is complete, but we let the users inform us of how complete or lovable or mature or viable it is. So that's where we are right now, and that's why we're talking about this. And then the second part to that, I think, is like, given this job to be done that we believe people hire subgroups for, what scenarios should we write? Now, subgroups is a category, but subgroups can't exist without groups. So that's why instead of, I think, looking at the name of the category and saying, well, we're testing subgroups, so let's just keep the scenarios constrained to subgroups, is a bit of a trap, because you actually have to know about groups and set up groups to have subgroups in the first place. So that's why I think maybe Daniel talking about the job to be done. And then, so like if we know the job to be done statement, then we'll know what scope of the product we need to include in the scenarios to get that validation that we need about the maturity level of subgroups.
Yeah, and that's basically what Kat brought up in regards to, for example, the first job to be done. The statement was, when I want to organize my resources, I need to be able to create groupings that represent my organization so I can manage permissions effectively. So logically,
could we write that down?
It's in the document. I can add it to this thing here. Do you want me to put it in the agenda for today?
Yeah, the agenda, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I linked to the category maturity scorecard page too. Then we have a link to the persona that we believe performs that job. And then Daniel's going to link to the issue that has the job to be done statement. And we probably just copy and paste that statement in here so we can keep track of it. Yeah, and this is something really, I'm really glad, Peter and Gian, that you're here, because you could give us some tips on how to set up a .com environment to test the subgroup scenarios.
Locally, you mean? Like set up a .com environment?
Yeah, I don't know if it'd be local or like actually on .com. Like,
oh.
Yeah, because the participant has to be able to use the product. They have to be able to use GitLab. So typically the category maturity studies have been done on gitlab.com.
Okay.
But we set up, environment's probably not the right word, but we set up, we set stuff up so that they can do the scenarios.
Yeah,
it's really morning. It's early in the morning for me. I'm sorry.
It's all good.
All good.
The deal is that whenever you want to test other objects within GitLab, it's not necessarily a problem because the object doesn't necessarily have like an entry point. It just exists. So you don't have to establish something ahead of time in that testing. Whereas if we're going to be testing subgroups, the logical entry point is the group entrance or the instance of a self-managed environment. So if somebody has to come into this process when it's already skipped past the creation of the initial object of group, then you've already removed that experience of testing or the ability to ask a user, does this architecture or does this logic make sense when you go through this process? And then it creates a subgroup process. So that's the concern that I have, is that if I'm doing this testing, am I removing a large portion of the whole thing that we really want to investigate? Or is it the investigation of the maturity scorecard here really just focused down to the functional piece of a subgroup?
Yeah, great. That makes sense.
Sounds like you have an idea, Austin. Do you want to voice your what you wrote there?
Yeah, I was considering that job and thinking about how, Daniel, you might be able to give a level playing field for the participants that work in your study. And an idea that I had was you could create like a complex organizational diagram with the number of users, and ask the participant to try and match that organization within GitLab. So that gives them the freedom to set up groups and subgroups and however they would like to do that. And that would tell you, were they able to achieve what they thought was the right result based off of, I don't know, like an org chart, which is what most people will deal with. I will say, like, in my experience, what ends up happening is for Sydney, there are a number of projects that exist, and she has to go back and figure out how to organize all of them back into groups and subgroups because they've just been running rampant because there has been no good administration on GitLab, and now she kind of has to reorganize how everything fits, which is maybe even a harder problem to solve, but it is one that faces enterprises that I've seen.
Yeah, that's
just another advantage. Sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
no, that's just quickly. That's more or less what I was thinking. Is that saying, here I have an organizational model of just a fictitious group. Let's go ahead and go through the process and tell me if you can do this, or can you map your organization to GitLab if you know what your organization looks like, or that might be a bit of different rewording, but yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think if people try to model their own organization, we're basically creating a new variable with every test, with every participant, where we want as consistent as possible, not just like the GitLab.com environment, but like the scenarios and the parameters of the scenarios. So I think having a fictitious org model, I think the question becomes like, how complex should that org model be to get the validation that we need, right? Yeah, so I think that's going to maybe part of the scenario writing as well. Inherently do a little bit of investigation into like what are some current org structures that customers use, and I wouldn't be surprised if those artifacts are laying around in our own Google Drive, when like salespeople or some person talks to a customer and they're like, oh, here's a Visio diagram of our org structure. We could find a close approximation.
Give me just 1 second. I don't know if my stove is on and I smell something. 1 second.
If you smell something, it probably is.
I've seen recordings of streams where this goes horribly wrong, so I'm hoping for the best.
No, it's just the downstairs neighbor. Okay.
Oh, well, that could be another problem.
Is it okay?
Yeah. Not my problem until the building's on fire. Yeah.
Check the temperature of your feet there, Daniel, every few minutes. Yeah. Take off your shoes and kind of rub your feet on the floor and make sure it's not too hot.
Exactly. So yeah, I agree. The unified or fictitious org model would be a good start for that, because that way it's a static variable across everyone. The complexity is one thing I also wanted to investigate. So obviously subgroups need to have at least maybe 1 or 2 sublevels. I'd like to have the logic be 2, 3 sublevels, but then also across. So how deep, but also wide the org could be, and how maybe to relate to that as part of that problem. But that's further down the road as I continue to draw out these doodles and this sketch. But yeah, that was the main concern, and the reason I wanted to chat with some other folks here was that problem of the initial entry point of the group.
Yeah, it looks like Melissa and Kat are scheduled to show up in like 2 minutes or a minute and a half.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I wanted to give enough time for anyone else to participate, and I didn't know if anyone had to add to this agenda, so I didn't want to jump in the front of the meeting and
You're all good.
Monopolize the whole hour.
I think since Nick and Amanda weren't able to make it today, that kind of gave us a lot of extra time.
Yeah. Yeah, they're jumping in right now, they said.
Sweet.
Hello, Melissa. Hey, Kat.
Hey.
So I kind of explained the problem. Kat already knows. Maybe Melissa, I'll just briefly bring it up. Kat and I were talking about how do we want to do the testing. And one of the problems we were discussing was if we're discussing a testing scenario with subgroups and we're going to be offering them a pristine environment to make sure we have the same testing variables, the problem will be that they have to then understand the concept of groups. And so if I'm going to be testing just subgroups, I won't be able to offer, well, basically invalidate the whole entry point discussion point for subgroups, which I don't think would be an efficient way to grade the category maturity. So I was thinking perhaps we should expand this to groups and subgroups. Secondly, how would we go about creating an environment to test that with users so that they would get a clean environment, a clean entry point, starting from 0 and setting up a fictitious org model. And that way we can get some good feedback on category maturity across subgroups and groups. And we also have some running dialogue here in our agenda. Actually, you probably won't see it because it's not in the associated doc, but I'll attach that right now. Sorry about that. Oh, you put it in the agenda, in the chat. Okay, thanks.
That.
So yeah,
I think some of the confusion is like the category is called subgroups, but subgroups don't really exist without groups. So like to Daniel's point, like what should the entry point for the testing scenarios be? And so I think with Daniel's job statement, we use that as the guide. Like if someone's going to accomplish this job, then this is what the environment and this is what the scenarios need to be so that we can watch them try to do that, finish that job with these scenarios so that we can get our findings and our insights and our maturity score.
Melissa, can we have a structure that is already started and ask them to add on to it? I mean, yes, that would get to the exact issue of we want to have only subgroups tested. But that was my question is, if that's the case, then perhaps we narrow the descriptions or narrow the category maturity scorecard and narrow the jobs to be done.
So in your mind, what would be the difference between testing groups and subgroups? Just so I'm on the sort of like understanding what you're saying correctly.
Yeah, the important part is in regards to subgroups, organizing a business or organizing an organization, as well as permissions as it relates to that organizational model, how you would architect those permissions based off of the job statements we have made or the jobs to be done. So if we only care about subgroups, then I think my concern is that we would limit the scope of a lot of this. So perhaps the permissions is not necessarily the point, but I don't think that's good. I think we should actually include the totality of it because it's not just an individual thing that we want to test. We want to understand how these problems link and how they need to be resolved if we can raise a maturity level. So right now it's only as complete in that the maturity rating exists, but we'd like it to get to lovable, and we know that it's not necessarily lovable. Does that make sense?
So yeah, to me, the only thing that's unique to groups versus subgroups, right, is like the fact that the top level group is used for like specific things that are related to like an organization, right? And it's very few. So I think there's actually, in my mind at least, not that big of a difference between like a group and a subgroup. There's actually only one category and we call it subgroups. We don't have like a group per se.
Well, we don't have a group outside of the .com, or excuse me, in the .com, we only have the one group that the people exist in, and then everything else under that is a subgroup, versus a self-managed where they can make a bunch of groups. But then that goes back to our other issue of like, maybe we need a container above all this, and which then says below that you have your groups and then your subgroups. But yeah, this is where I'm saying I think it's both, but it also is different. It's hard to describe. But that was what I was saying, is that I wanted to make sure I had the correct testing methodology.
Sorry about the abrupt screen takeover.
Yeah,
I was muted and I thought I was warning everybody, but I couldn't talk. Or you couldn't hear me. Sorry, I just want to point out the definition of subgroups does sound a lot like just a group capability, even though it's called subgroups. Separate internal, external organizations, organize large projects, make it easier to manage and control visibility. So I think it might be kind of splitting hairs to say, like, are we validating groups or subgroups because the two can't really exist?
Right.
Is that kind of what we're saying? Or yeah, I'm just curious if that's a valid assumption that I'm making on my part.
That was my
That's
perception.
what I'm saying, Mike,
Okay.
but I don't know if that's why I was asking, like, is there something specific that we say, this is different enough between groups and subgroups that, like, we believe it's too much to test them together? And I was trying to get at what is that thing that we think is.
That's my understanding, is that there's nothing wildly different between the two. And so I wanted to make sure that I wrote the statements and the description and all the research around the correct description of the problem. So it's groups and subgroups, not just subgroups. Again, based off of how someone arrives to that testing scenario. So they have to create a group, or they have to open up a new account at GitLab to then go to the creation of their organization. Because I was trying to plan all this, how does somebody start this testing environment? And how do they get to that point where I can start asking questions? Okay, now build this organizational model and let me know how you solve this problem and how your thinking process goes.
Do you want to talk us through a bit, Daniel, about our current thoughts about creating a testing scenario? I think we had talked about that right before Catherine and Melissa joined.
Yeah, and just the idea of, Austin had come up with a really good idea of that we just provide them a predefined, or like a pre-drawn generic dummy org, and say, can you do this? Let me know how you would map this in the system and talk me through your process. I think we were just saying we could do that as a blank group, but I wanted to make sure that like I said, the entry point didn't ignore the process of creating the initial group or creating the first step.
How long do we allot for these tests? Like, how long will we ask people to kind of like work with us?
I'm not sure, Kat, you'd have to ask that one.
Yeah, so the test can be, well, there's no specific time limit for it. Well, aside from the general time limit that you don't want to go over an hour for testing usually. So depending on how complex it is, it could be within 30 minutes or it could be a longer one. I think a shorter one is probably a better target, just so they don't get fatigued, but there's some space for longer setups if that's needed to be tested.
Yeah, that was my assumption.
The sessions I moderated were scheduled for an hour, and they took anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to complete.
Yeah, and that's what my fear was. I didn't want to have this long, drawn out process, because functionally creating your org should be very simple. But if it's a problem of the tools don't exist in GitLab, or the logic is not easily understandable, and it takes an hour or more to create a simple org, then that's obviously something we want to know. But my hope is that it's not. It's like, oh yeah, click, 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 done.
Yeah, maybe we can start with having them from scratch, right? And then we can see if it's taking too long. We give them like a head start with something that's kind of like half there already. Although, like, if something's half there already, I worry that we're sort of like showing them how to do it, right?
Yeah,
because something's already there.
Exactly it. That's my fear.
So maybe we can do that, but then like for the second half of the exercises, right, where you're assigning permissions and stuff, we can have like another group that's already built out, and there's just sort of like using it to do like group sharing and adding members and so forth, right? So we don't depend so much on the first part, because if they do that wrong, then there's sort of host for the other part of the exercise. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't think about, is breaking up the test categories to organization and permissions. And so organization is one issue, and then breaking up the permissions, assignment or definitions or sharing could be other stage. And I don't think, I'm not seeing, because I'm thinking about it as a GitLab employee, but I'm not seeing much problem in that environment. I think if you say, okay, this is your org, it's already been established, how would you assign or, define or share preferences across? Mike or Kat, do you see any sort of bad logic in that?
I just want to say, I think I need to see a draft of the scenarios, and then we talk about that when we see the draft of scenarios. But the issue tracking and the code merge request scenarios and sessions were scheduled for an hour, and there were like 13 or 14 scenarios in the issue tracking one and like 14 or 15 in the code review one. So I think as long as you don't give them like the org structure of like a huge corporation, right? It's like I don't think it's important that it's like a really huge org structure and it's complex. It just needs to be like, there's groups, and some groups have more permissions than others or can see certain things. And so yeah, I think I need to see the scenarios though to like kind of further that, like contribute to that conversation. But
yeah, I think that's also, I didn't want to make like a super chaotic group, because I don't think that would answer any question. I think it would just make more confusion than necessary.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think in the code review scenarios, there was kind of a similar thing when it came to code owner approvals, where I believe Pedro didn't take them through the process of setting up code owners, but they just had to like set approvers. So it's a similar thing for their permissions, where you could have the existing organization, but then the focus is on just like how they work with the permissions, because you would have already tested their capability to set up an organization earlier. So that makes sense to me.
Cool. So I think this all makes sense. Peter, do you want to jump in?
I was just going to say that if you're only testing like free functionality, then you could have them set up the group. But if you're doing anything around that's like included in silver or gold, I think you might run into an issue where if they set up a group, then they won't be able to set up the billing to actually test those features. So they'd have to do like open up like an access request or something to get that group upgraded. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that. My assumption was that it would be, the test environment would be the max, top level features we have. But maybe that shouldn't be the
I'm
test.
not.
Maybe
you may be able to set it up like that, but like in the past when I was testing a feature, I created a group and then had to get an access request to get it upgraded to like silver so I could test that feature. But there may be another way. Just throwing it out there.
Okay, that's something I didn't think about. And I don't know, like I said, should I just assume we're going to be testing at the max level access environment as a kind of just quick entry versus all the levels?
I guess it kind of depends on the scenarios. Like if you're just testing, if you don't want them to run through any scenarios that require like enterprise features, then you can just use the free tier, is my understanding. But if there are scenarios that require those features, then you would have to set up billing, I think.
Yeah, I think, Daniel, let's work out what the scenarios are, and then we can figure out what tier they align to.
That sounds good. We can do that in our one-on-one later. Well, this was cool. I appreciate the insight and help. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add.
Do you remember
Just a note.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Austin.
I added on like a hyperlink where I mentioned I knew a little bit of my old org structure. I added a Mermaid Editor link. It's not exactly what my org looked like, but it generally kind of shows you some of the flow down of a complex enterprise. It's way worse than it looks. So I tried to simplify it a lot, but with only a few children in there. So that if you needed some inspiration, there's some inspiration for you.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I like this a lot.
Probably depends on which hill you stand on too, Austin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's kind of this serendipitous like kind of thing. I just realized that in the working group, simplify projects and groups, one of the things that came out of an earlier conversation we had, probably like a couple of months ago now, one of the ideas was to actually research common organization structures that our customers might have. And so I see like a similarity in effort here between what the working group is trying to accomplish and what we'll learn from this category maturity scorecard. So if part of the scenario is to model an organization, and that organization is going to be a derivative of common organization structures of our customers, then we're sort of feeding two birds with one stone here, which makes me happy. That makes the birds happy too.
I like that twist on, on that saying, Mike.
Yeah, it's nonviolent. Yeah, unless there's like, unless the scone is laced with poison, it's a nonviolent metaphor.
Well, yeah, this is all super helpful. Thanks, everyone.
So I just have a question. So part of my initial confusion was that I know groups was like made to not be an official category or something maybe last year, and so it's just subgroups. But that was confusing to me because I was like, does that mean groups is no longer being worked on or on the roadmap, or why is it just subgroups? So that's where my confusion came from, and it's still a question I have.
So Kat, I actually asked about that because that was confusing to me as well. And basically the answer is that groups and subgroups are essentially the same thing, right? They're like containers that can be nested or basically be standalone at the top level. And that we chose the term subgroups over groups because subgroups denotes that they can be nested versus groups does not. So that was kind of like why they're named that way.
Thank you.
I think that helps like a buyer decider kind of distinguish between, okay, well, you have groups, but like, what can we do with them? And if we call them subgroups, it kind of advances that question. So that's really smart, but it's confusing for me. Do you feel like, Daniel, you got enough people talking at you to know, to know what to do?
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate this. Like I said, it was really helpful and insightful, and I have some ideas. And Melissa and I are going to follow up later anyways on the specifics with the grade or what level of GitLab they'll have. Cool. Well, if no one has anything else, I guess we could just close the meeting early.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Peter and Gian, like this conversation, especially the latter part about the category maturity scorecard, how useful was it for you?
Pretty useful for me because I didn't know really much about it at all. So it's just anytime I have an opportunity to get more context about the rest of, or like work that other people are working on and other roles are working on, it's pretty helpful, I think.
Yeah, likewise. Just being a fly on the wall of this is quite informative. It's also good to know what's going around inside the UX space and knowing how I can better support that from a front-end space.
Cool. Yeah, the category maturity scorecard does lead to recommendation issues. Like we don't just have this repository of video recordings and insights. We actually turn it into actionable issues and hopefully, try to make them shovel ready, so to speak. So they're recommendations, but they're sort of scoped at a reasonable level so we can incrementally nip a lot of the problems that we identified during the research in the bud and make the experience better. So we often identify gaps in the experience or the learnability of a feature. Also, and we also kind of poke at like the valuable aspect, like, so you're able to accomplish that scenario. Is this valuable for you? Like the way that we're solving this. So it'll lead to more further work that is, hopefully changes that we can make that then get delivered to customers. And then we learn again because we delivered iterations on the solution to customers. Which is why your participation is really valuable.
All right, cool. Well, we have 10 minutes left. I guess that's it. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for the insight.
Bye, everyone.